In this video, I want to talk about the importance of planning a painting before you start it. And what I mean by planning is doing some sketches first of all before you start your painting to plan out the composition. And I didn't do any of that with this painting, and I ended up running into a load of problems, which you'll see in this video. So this is what I want to demonstrate to you, really how not to do things with a painting. Because as I say, I ran into loads of problems with this painting. I spent far too long on it. I got frustrated with it, and all up, a lot of these problems could have been solved had I done some prior sketches before I started it. Now I'll just explain why I didn't do any prior planning for this painting, also why you're seeing this video without the blocking in stage, because I didn't actually record that and there was a reason why. So when I started this painting, I was actually overseas in Australia visiting my partner's family, and trying to get any painting done in my partner's parents' house was pretty difficult. So what I did was I was going to a place called the Tonal Art Centre, which is on the Central Coast in Australia, and they were letting me paint there during the day. They also had painting classes as well, and I was just sitting there and just painting anyway. So on the particular morning that I painted this artwork at the Tonal Art Centre, there was a group of people there as well, some other painters, and I only had a few hours to make a start on this painting, and I really wanted to get into it. Now I thought the reference photo, which I'll show you now, was a reasonably good naturally forming composition. I thought the tree in the background was pretty interesting. I liked the waterfall and the water in the foreground as well. And I thought, I could get most of the information from the photo, so perhaps maybe I don't need to do a pencil sketch. But what I did was a couple of very quick thumbnail sketches, and then I just got straight into it. So I carried out the blocking in stage of the painting whilst I was in Australia in the Tonal Art Centre, and unfortunately I wasn't able to record it on film. But since I came back to New Zealand, it's just been sat on my shelf for a little while, and I've been meaning to finish it, and I started working on it over a few sessions just to try and get it finished, and that's where I really started running into problems, which you'll see in this video. So as I say, I just want to talk about the importance of planning a painting before you start so you can avoid these types of problems. I had compositional errors. I even had issues with not really looking at the reference photo properly and finding that the main tree that I'd painted was actually not what was in the photo, which I'll talk about in a bit. So let's talk about the vegetation here, as I'm working on that. The colours I mainly used for this was a mix of cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, which kind of formed the base of my green. There's also a little bit of yellow ochre in there, and I would have mixed in a bit of cadmium red just to harmonise the green, because the red is opposite to green on the colour wheel, so it helps to knock back the saturation of the green. Now you could also use an alizarin crimson or a burnt sienna as well. I've used titanium white to make the value of the colour lighter. It will also have a desaturating effect on the green, so that's something to keep in mind. And I've also mixed in a little bit of phthalo green into the mix, which just kicks up the saturation of the green. So if you've ever seen some of these really rich greens in paintings like this one, mixing in a little bit of phthalo green really adds a richness to the colour. I used oil paints to paint this artwork, but you could just as easily paint something like this in acrylics as well. And the colours I used includes titanium white, burnt sienna, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, cadmium red light, alizarin crimson, ultramarine blue and phthalo green. So my usual kind of simple palette that I like to use for landscape paintings. Now during the blocking in stage, when I initially applied these colours and layers of paint, I wasn't worried about detail at all, so the brushwork is relatively loose. But now I'm getting into the modelling stage of the painting, where I'm starting to build up the detail in the various elements within the painting, such as the vegetation. Now when I was painting the vegetation just a moment ago, I was using a number 3 filbert brush, a bristle filbert brush. It's got a nice rounded edge to it, so it's good for painting foliage. and I was applying lighter layers of paint over the existing layers and a bit more sparingly. Even here I'm using a 1/4 inch dagger brush and sparingly applying some of these highlights to the foliage. So that's going to build out the form of the trees here, make them look more rounded and three-dimensional. And we're just gradually building up the tones in the painting, so applying lighter layers, and then I save my lightest values until last. That's always a good way to go, so starting off darker and then working in lights. In general, I keep my paintings tonally darker as I work through them, especially to start with, and then I build up those lighter layers, and it's so that I don't use all my lightest values from the get-go and then later on I can't add anything lighter because I've already used them already, and that can result in a very flat looking painting. So that's something to keep in mind. Now if you're unsure of where your darks and lights are in the painting, you can always take your reference photo and just switch it to black and white, and you'll be able to clearly see where all the dark values are, value being how light or dark your subject is. Very important in painting. In fact, I think it's probably more important than even the colours that you use. Of course the colour mixing is important too, but values really are the key to creating a realistic looking painting. Now one of the other things I did there just a moment ago was to paint some of the occlusion shadows that are within the vegetation in the background there, and that was mainly a mix of yellow ochre and ultramarine blue, which creates just a really nice dark colour, and it has a green undertone to it, so it's really good for painting shadow areas within stands of trees or vegetation. The other thing is, as well, as it mixes in nicely with your highlight greens as well, if you want to sort of gradually create a transition zone from light to dark. Now at this point in the painting I thought it was well underway, and I was adding details to the rocks. I was using brushes with a synthetic hair such as this 1/4 inch ivory dagger brush, because this produces some much finer marks. The bristles also meet to a nice fine point as well, so you can get some really delicate detail in there. And the other cool thing about the 1/4 inch ivory dagger brush here is you can use that broad end of the brush as well for painting things like the lines and the cracks in the rocks here. So I was also marking in some of these shadows as well in the rocks, and I was actually mainly using ultramarine blue with some burnt sienna, so that's creating a really dark mix here, mainly for these occlusion shadows. And then actually I could lighten some of these shadows by mixing in some titanium white and even some alizarin crimson as well, so it just gives it a nice violet undertone. But mainly blue is one of the predominant colours in the mix. So adding finer detail here, especially in these small stones, and just using the tip of this dagger brush to apply the paint. Now one thing I've noticed about Australian landscapes is that they're completely different to landscapes in New Zealand. There's a lot more kind of reds and oranges and olive tones in the foliage, more reds and oranges in the rocks and things like that. Whereas like New Zealand, for example, is actually kind of similar more to the kind of colours you'd get in Europe or in North America, especially as there's been a lot of European and American trees that have been introduced into New Zealand. It also rains a lot in New Zealand as well, so most of the time it's very green, whereas Australia is oftentimes pretty dry. But anyway, Australian landscapes, in my opinion, are pretty interesting to paint, and I definitely want to paint some more of them. So back to the painting here, I was adding some details to the water. So here, for example, I'm just painting some of these subtle reflections in the ripples here. This part of the water's in shadow, but it's reflecting the sky, so I was mainly using a mix of ultramarine blue with some titanium white and a little phthalo green. Now these rocks here, I'm using a mix of yellow ochre with titanium white, a little bit of alizarin crimson, and just a small amount of ultramarine blue. So they're pretty light in value, they're kind of a creamy colour, and the ultramarine blue in the mix helps to desaturate the colour so it's not too yellow. But then the alizarin crimson in the mix is helping to prevent green, because the ultramarine blue and the alizarin crimson together is producing a violet colour, And alizarin crimson is a violet anyway, and violet is opposite to yellow on the colour wheel, so they're cancelling each other out. So that's how we can desaturate those types of colours and create that kind of pale, sandy, rock coloured look. Now here I was getting into some finer detail. You can see on the right side of the painting here that I'm using a mole fork, which just helps to keep your arm more steady. Sometimes my hand's a little bit shaky when I'm painting, so just using a mole fork here helps you to get some finer marks. And you know, I thought I was well underway with this painting at this point, and I was actually hoping to see if I could get it finished in this painting session, or even get it mostly finished that I could, when I came back to it, just add a few last details that was going to bring the whole thing to life. Now I just painted some of the reflected light in the main stem of this gum tree here in the background, which was one of the main features of the composition. And I actually used the same colours that I used for the rocks, but the value of it's darker and the colours just a little bit more saturated. So I'd used a bit more yellow ochre and alizarin crimson in the mix. I say it was alizarin crimson, I think I might have used burnt sienna, but I mean either colour would have worked. And then moving on to the water here in the waterfall, I didn't use straight titanium white from the tube. I made the value a bit darker by adding in some ultramarine blue, a little burnt sienna and a little alizarin crimson. So making the value of it a little bit darker means that I can layer over some lighter layers as I work through the painting, and again that's just going to bring out the three-dimensional form of the water. And then I was pretty much using that same colour mix to paint some of the branches in this gum tree. There's quite a few species of gum tree in Australia that have this kind of white bark, white greyish looking bark, even some creamy coloured bark as well. There's lots of different species of gum tree, and that's what I wanted to communicate in this painting. Now here at this point I had put my brushes down. I'd allowed the painting to dry because there was quite a few more details to be added, and what you're seeing here is the next session I worked on this painting, and this is where I really started to run into problems, as you'll see in just a moment. So I was adding some highlights here to the water, and this was mainly some titanium white with a little bit of yellow ochre. I was just tidying up some of these rocks here, just re-emphasizing and restating some of these shadows and the occlusion shadows. And then I went to work again on the canopy of this gum tree here. Now in the actual reference photo, the foliage was not particularly thick at all, and also the value of the foliage was kind of a mid-tone as well, so some of it was already getting lost in the sky in the background. So the foliage was very thin, not like the much thicker and denser vegetation that I've got in the midsection of the painting here. Now I was keeping in mind that the foliage of the trees was not particularly dense, and I decided that I needed to basically build out the tree canopy a bit further, add some more form and definition to it, but also make the foliage thicker in the painting than it was compared with the actual reference photo. So I was using my sky mix here just to paint the negative spaces around the tree canopy so that I could then layer on some more colour over the top of the tree foliage. And I was also painting some sky holes in the trees as well. That's what I'm doing here. I'm using a number 3 filbert brush. As I was painting this tree canopy here, it just really wasn't working. I was trying to add more to it just to bring out the tree canopy, painting in some of these stems and branches here using small brushes like this number 1 synthetic round brush, and then going back with my tree foliage mix, which was mostly yellow ochre with some ultramarine blue and cadmium yellow, also a little cadmium red light in there and a little titanium white. But this is where I spotted the problem, and actually it was from not looking at the reference photo properly, which I would have noticed had I have done some sketches and prior planning. Now what I didn't realise was the clumps of tree foliage that I was seeing was not from the tree that's coming out of the vegetation here, but in fact the tree behind it, and it looks like it's the vegetation and leaves from the tree that's coming out of the vegetation. So a real error there that I should have spotted, and I would have spotted it if I'd have done some proper planning and created a pencil sketch. So then I realised the problem in that the tree that I was painting wasn't the actual tree that was in the reference photo. So what I did was I decided I need to start this whole thing again, at least with the tree. So I painted over it with the sky mix, and then after that I put my brushes down again so that I could let the painting dry. It was a pretty frustrating painting session. So here I was painting the tree canopies of the tree in the background, now realising that it is in the background, and mostly using a mix of yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, ultramarine blue as the main part of my green, and then some cadmium red mixed in for those more olive tones, because that's certainly what you get in a lot of gum trees in Australia. They kind of have an olivey green colour, and there's also some titanium white in the mix as well. So these were going to be the background trees, and then I was going to paint the main tree coming out. So I was making a start on this again and using a number 1 synthetic round brush and a mix of ultramarine blue and burnt sienna with a little alizarin crimson to paint the main twigs and stems, branches of the tree, and then making a start on painting the foliage. So the foliage here, I was going to make it look a bit thinner and like it was hanging in clumps, but also the value a bit darker as well than compared with what was in the reference photo. And I was applying the paint here with a 1/4 inch bristle dagger brush. So painting the tree foliage here, often using the broad end of the brush as well, and just dragging some of the paint down to make it look like those clumps of leaves are just hanging off the branches. Now I've got to admit, at this point in the painting I was starting to get a bit annoyed with myself, thinking I've spent so much time on this painting and I'm still not close to having it finished. And the painting size is only 6 inches by 8 inches, so I was just spending way too long on it than I should have, because really this is intended as a small painting that perhaps I could use for a study for a larger artwork. Probably I might paint this scene, but more emphasis on the water and just a bit of the vegetation in the background. I haven't decided. I really like the water in the foreground as well, and I've got plenty of reference photos of this particular area. I can't remember whether I said where this area was actually, but it's in Katoomba, which is where the Blue Mountains are. So this is just round the corner from the main viewing area, but it's a really beautiful location. So anyway, back to the tree, and you can see here that I'd really fleshed out the overall form of the tree canopy, re-added in some of those main stems and branches, added in some of the highlights there, and that was mostly using a mix of ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, titanium white and a little alizarin crimson. Now I use these colour combinations a lot for many elements in landscape painting, just because they're such a useful colour combination. Really good for painting shadows, shadows in clouds, in rocks, shadows in distant landforms or in mountains, things like that. So quite often if you're unsure of something and you just need to perhaps paint some dark values in there, but you're unsure of the colour, there can be a good go-to colour combination. And then I was working on the foreground again and painting some of these quite bright orange tones that were in the rocks here, and that was mostly using yellow ochre with burnt sienna, titanium white, a little bit of ultramarine blue if I needed to desaturate it, but not much ultramarine blues needed. But I also even mixed in a little cadmium yellow and cadmium red, only a small amount just to boost the saturation of the colour. And then adding more highlights to some of these rocks here. Again, I'm using a 1/4 inch synthetic dagger brush. So I hope you're enjoying the video so far. Now, are you struggling with your landscape paintings? Perhaps you're not able to paint the artworks that you'd imagined in your head, or you're struggling with composition, tonal values and colour mixing. Well, let me help you. Download my free Landscape Painter's Blueprint. What this does is it provides you with a solid methodology for painting that's going to give you predictable results with your artworks. Inside, I explain my process of how I select photos, do sketches, design composition, so I'll give you some composition ideas in there, then also colour mixing, understanding tonal values, and then there's also a painting demonstration at the end of it. So if you'd like that free guide, the landscape painting blueprint, just click the link below. As I say, it's there for you for free. Now then, I'd put my paintbrushes down again so I could let it dry. And then when I was looking at the painting on my easel, I noticed another major problem that I didn't spot, which could have been alleviated had I done some prior planning. So this time what I'd failed to notice is the tree canopy of the main tree that I'd just repainted was getting lost in the sky, and that the clouds that I'd painted either side were just touching the edge of the canopy. So because the value of the sky was a similar value to the tree foliage that I just painted, that whole tree canopy just wasn't standing out. And from a composition perspective, it wasn't very good either. So this really needed addressing. So what I did was I extended the clouds so that some of the tree's canopy could be seen contrasting against the clouds in the background. And that means because the clouds are of a lighter value, it means the tree foliage is going to stand out. So I did that on both sides. And then the other thing that I did was I made the value of the sky lighter. And I'm still using the same colours as before, which was ultramarine blue, a little phthalo green and titanium white, but a lot more titanium white in the mix this time. So now that I've done that, you can see here that the tree canopy at least stands out in the painting. And then I had to repaint some of these branches and stems. I decided to make them a lot lighter because the trees in the background actually had white stems and branches, so I just copied the reference from that. So making these stems and branches lighter so that they stand out in the painting. Getting into some more kind of finer detail here, so I was using number 1 and number 0 synthetic pointed round brushes, which is what I'm using here, and mostly a mix of titanium white with a little yellow ochre and a little bit of alizarin crimson, really just a tiny amount. So anyway, once I'd alleviated that problem, I was then able to properly work on this tree and get it looking good in the painting. Here I'm painting some of the reflected light that's in the branches. So because it's light in value, the colour of the bark is light in value, then the shadows are also going to be lighter. So I was using a mix of ultramarine blue, a little alizarin crimson, titanium white and just a bit of burnt sienna just to desaturate the colour. Again, I repainted some of the stems and branches using a dark mix of ultramarine blue and some burnt sienna. And then finally, I was starting to feel a lot happier with this particular tree. So now I was actually thinking about, right, I just want to get this painting finished. As I said, I spent way too long on it. Way longer than I should have. It really shouldn't have taken 4 painting sessions. I think it was 4 or maybe even 5. I don't know. But regardless, way too long. It shouldn't have taken that long to paint this. I should have had it done in about 2, maybe 3 painting sessions at the most. For a painting this size, keep in mind it's only a 6" by 8" painting. So what I was doing here is I was adding these last highlights to the foliage in the background, and I'm using a 1/4" bristle dagger brush. And still using the same green mix that I've been using before. So if you remember, this is mostly cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue to form the base green. And then there's some titanium white, a little cadmium red light and some phthalo green in there. Now lastly, I was painting a few little highlights to the trees in the background. They're mostly olive tones, but I thought maybe a few kind of grass green hues in there would look good. So it's pretty much the same foliage mix I use, but just a bit of a suggestion of that. And then back to the main tree, and I wanted to paint some darker foliage here so that it stands out a bit more. So there's just a lot more ultramarine blue in the mix, and I've even mixed in a little bit more cadmium red to get that kind of reddish olive tone that you get in a lot of gum trees in Australia. And then coming in to paint the final details here. So what I wanted to do with some of the foliage here is just paint the suggestion of some shimmering leaves in the sun and just some lighter value colour. So I was working off my existing green, but then I was mixing in more cadmium yellow and titanium white. So the cadmium yellow is still going to keep the colour a little bit saturated so that it's still in harmony with the rest of the vegetation. And I'm using a number 0 synthetic pointed round brush here to add those last little details. So then, what did I learn from this painting? Well, even though I'm now more of an experienced painter and I thought I could get away with just copying a photo, I now realise that even with this experience, that not doing any prior planning landed me in trouble with this painting. Not only did I not observe the photo properly and realise that there was 2 separate trees there when I thought there was one, but then the other compositional error that I ran into, where the tree canopy was disappearing into the sky behind it and the 2 clouds touching both sides of the tree canopy, just didn't look good. And as I say, with some prior planning and a proper sketch, and I would have looked at that photo properly, I could have alleviated this problem. The other frustrating thing is the amount of time it took me to paint this. I spent way too long, and had I done a prior sketch to this, I don't think I would have spent anywhere near as much time on this painting. So there's some lessons learned from my mistakes there. So just to encourage you to do some sketches before you start a painting. They don't have to be brilliant works of art or anything, but just to help you to plan the composition so it helps to see the road ahead. Anyway, despite all the time this took me, I think this painting turned out alright in the end. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and it's given you a bit of inspiration. Happy painting, thank you for subscribing, and I shall see you in the next video.